The standard account of the American Revolution is a story of pure ideological defiance, patriots pushed too far by a tyrannical king. We're often taught that the British government, buried in debt from the French and Indian War, imposed an unbearable tax burden that threatened to drive the American colonists into poverty. However, the financial ledgers from the 1770s tell a different story. The average citizen in London paid 26 shillings a year in taxes. Meanwhile, the average American colonist was paying exactly 1 shilling. Americans were the most lightly taxed citizens in the Western world. When placed against the actual tax records of the era, the image of a colony being bankrupted by the crown begins to look less like history and more like effective political branding. This brings us to the Tea Act of 1773. Popular history suggests the British government used this law to hike prices to a level the colonists could no longer afford. In reality, the Tea Act granted the East India Company a major tax break, allowing them to sell their product in America at a lower price than ever before. This creates a strange contradiction. The colonists responded with violence to a policy that was making a staple household good cheaper. If the tax burden was negligible and the price of tea was falling, we must look for a different economic threat powerful enough to spark a war. To understand the reaction, we have to look at salutary neglect. For decades, the British government left trade laws on the books, but sent no one to enforce them, effectively allowing the colonies to govern their own docks. Because there were no customs agents to collect that 1 shilling tax, most colonists simply didn't pay it at all. This lack of oversight allowed a sprawling shadow economy to take root. Merchants built entire careers by importing cheap French molasses and Dutch tea without paying a single cent to the crown. By the mid-18th century, the colonial economy was functioning as a vast, unpoliced black market. John Hancock is now a symbol of American patriotism, but in 1768, he was better known as Boston's most successful smuggler. Hancock's prominence and his merchant empire were built on the ability to move vast quantities of goods while avoiding British duties. When the British abruptly ended their neglect, they began patrolling the coast and seized Hancock's merchant vessel, the Liberty, on charges of tax evasion. Facing the loss of his livelihood, Hancock and his allies, Samuel Adams, organized a public response, channeling the anger of Boston citizens into a series of violent protests against the customs office. The early rallies of the Revolution were not just spontaneous outpourings of citizen frustration, they were a protective measure funded by wealthy men to secure their shipping lanes. This explains why the cheap tea from the Tea Act was so dangerous. It wasn't an olive branch. It was a direct threat to the smugglers' bottom line. If the East India Company sold tea cheaper than illegal Dutch tea, smugglers' inventories would become worthless, collapsing their financial networks. The Boston Tea Party was a tactical move. Destroying the legal inventory ensured higher-priced tea remained the only option. Stripped of the folklore, the event was a targeted act of corporate sabotage, intended to eliminate a low-cost competitor and maintain a local monopoly. Uncovering these financial motives doesn't mean the Enlightenment ideals of the Revolution were insincere. The belief in self-governance and individual rights was real. But high-minded philosophy is rarely enough to sustain a rebellion or equip an army. It requires a significant amount of capital. The colonial merchants realized that the only way to permanently stop the British from inspecting their cargo was to remove British authority entirely and establish a sovereign nation. It is a reminder that history is rarely driven by a single motive, especially when the figures leading the charge have a direct financial stake in the outcome. Before committing to a cause or a crusade for freedom, it is always worth looking past the slogans and checking the cargo manifest.